Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Uh, Welcome to the CORP seminar, which is a community of research and practice seminar that scaling city institutions in India for urban sanitation from the CPR anchors this particular seminar. And we are very privileged to have a person with us who is very renowned in Malaysia as well as in the world for her commitment towards the sewerage and sanitation sector. So welcome Punita. Punita Naidu is a Malaysian citizen, but she's been working on the sewerage and sanitation sector for almost like 20, more than 20 years. And she's worked extensively with the public and private sector. In 20 years of her career with in Malaysia, she has spent almost 18 years in sanitation sector. She has been part of the regulation. She is a there's a body which is called SPAN, which is a regulating authority in Malaysia. So she was part of it for almost 10 years, from 2008 to 2018. And she also served in the National Sewerage Commission, which is the India Water Consortium. So she has seen the sector evolve right from 90s to now in Malaysia. She's a chemical engineer and also holds a degree of business, master's in business administration, and she has enough experience to take us through the journey of Malaysia. Basically, why we thought it was useful to talk about regulations, because in India we are actually gearing up, and many states have come up with some regulations. National government is also carving out spaces for regulatory framework. So in Malaysia, in fact, since 1990s, it has been there. So how was the journey? What were the main barriers and challenges? What were the key lessons that India can learn from? So this is going to be the focus of today's talk, and I welcome Punita from CPR side. And we can structure this seminar in a way that she speaks for 40-45 minutes on her experience of Malaysia, and then we can open up for the discussions to the participants, and we can have questions and queries to her and ponder over the learnings that she would present. Thanks, Punita, and over to you.
Okay, thank you. Is it working?
Yeah, it's better.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for having me here. So I guess I go straight to the presentation because the time is tight and we're supposed to leave here. So I'll give a quick snapshot. I think the slides didn't work very well here, but just bear with the slides. Just give a quick snapshot in a glance about how the Malaysia setting is right now. So right now, Malaysia's population is 32 million. At the point of independence in 1957, it's about 7 million. Urban population have gone up 30 to 75%. So most of the Malaysia population are actually living in urban setting. In terms of sanitation, 96% has improved sanitation, and 70% of the population are actually having connected services. The balance 30% is actually either having pit latrines or septic tanks. I think pit latrines about 6 to 7%. At the point of independence, the policymaker for this particular sector was Ministry of Health, and now it's Ministry of Water, Land and Natural Resources. I'll go in the detail of that in later slides, how the transition actually takes place. During the early stage, the regulatory framework is extremely fragmented. Currently, there's one single regulator for both water and sewerage services sector. Previously, there's no tariff. It was actually recovered through annual assessment, the cost to maintain the services. Currently, there's monthly billing and standardized tariff nationwide. So there is a tariff regulation, and public operator have to abide by the tariff regulation. In terms of services, in 1957, water was run by state-owned departments, sewerage is by local authorities. But currently, water is run by private companies, state government controlled private companies or corporatized government department. Sewerage is by private company or federal and state government-owned private companies. So it's fully run by private sector. There are two local authorities still running their services, but actually they are very in a desperate need wanting to hand over to private sector. The way it started way back is on a direct user. I'll share a little bit more in the later slide. But currently the way planning and strategies are being done is tying up to the community and environment need, no more on the direct beneficiary. way back in 57, we do not have any regional facilities. Currently, there are 101 regional treatment plants. However, most of this regional treatment plant, I would say about 70% of it is actually constructed by private sector. Only 20% is funded by government. The rest are funded by private sector. So a bit on the technical and services part. As I mentioned, 70% is actually enjoying connected services. That is a good for the environment perspective, but very difficult on the operator's angle and regulator as well. Because what happened is, there are more than 10,000 treatment plants right now. 10,000 treatment plants actually causing proliferation of various kinds of processes, design and products. That creates a huge challenge for the operator to have the sufficient skill and knowledge to actually maintain a system. Because even a simple thing as like 60% is actually extended aeration system, but when it comes to extended aeration, some actually have diffusers, some have aspirators, some have surface aerators. So different kind of equipment require different way of monitoring and maintaining it. That means, and most of these operators at working level are non-skilled workers, and expecting them to have that kind of knowledge to differentiate various kind of technologies is actually quite a challenge. And this also lead to logistic and operational mess, as well as challenges in allocating skills and resources. Because this particular sector is actually, there was a matrix that we have done long time back, can safely say that the operator is actually operating at a potential failure 60% all the time. That means the chances of them failing at any point of time is 60%. And that due to low tariff and limited subsidy by the government. So that means the way the operational logistics is designed is, you will have a team covering up a certain area. That means a team to operate, to run treatment plants, another team to maintain the conveyance network. So, and they are actually spread thin. And as I mentioned earlier, the other part is on the skills aspect of it. That's the challenge. Based on a study that we have done, any facilities below 20,000 population equivalent. Population equivalent is actually a way we calculate population in certain area. For example, one house is for 5 population, commercial building 3 population per 100 meters squared. So there's a tabulation for that. I think somewhere I've given in this particular, I think on top there, if I actually count based on actual population, one person is equivalent to 2.7 population equivalent. So that is roughly what population equivalent means. So for 20,000 population equivalent, it is not effective to have a treatment plant. That means they cannot sustain based on current tariff. They are unable to sustain that. But in Malaysia, 95% of the treatment plant are sitting in that region, which is 20,000 population equivalent and below. Another part on the services. This I'm just giving you a snapshot so to prepare you for the later part of the slides. In 2017, there are 500,000 of inquiries and complaints recorded by India Water Consortium. India Water Consortium has extensive database. They are well prepared in terms of collection of data. So I'm using India Water Consortium's number here, which is published. Out of which, 78% is on billing, the inquiries, and but 5.6% on the connected services. So if I actually, that means 5.6% of the people who are receiving connected services have some problem with the services they are receiving. And they have 3.7 million accounted customers for connected services. If I actually just tabulate it mathematically, one accounted customer makes a complaint every 125 years. There is the likelihood someone with a connected services actually have a problem with connected services that they know of. I'm not saying the services are perfect. If there is a sewer being, if there's a sewer collapse and the sewage is flowing off to a drain, public do not face any problem with that. House owners do not face any problem. If a treatment plant not functioning, public do not face any problem, right? They only face problem when the sewer get blocked and is overflowing their property. That's when they will actually lodge a complaint. Otherwise, they do not know there's a problem. So they are actually unhappy 125 years once. But you can see the number of complaints they have when come to billing, 78%. So this is why I actually want to track down these facts. Is because sewage sector will not be a sector where people will say, now I understand why we need this. therefore I'm going to pay more, or I'm going to pay for it in the first place. That will not happen. So that is something that either private sector or government sector, if any government officials here, need to accept. That is the reality. Because this has been going on since 1993 in Malaysia. So if either Malaysians just don't learn, or this is just a global-wide scenario where people do not pay even though they only complain 125. Now the chances maybe they don't pay is because 125 years only they're having a problem. So how to even remember that if they don't pay, problems will happen, right? That's something. So the very desire to actually achieve for connected services will be counterproductive for any initiative by the government pushing for connected services. So connected services or even sanitation services should be pushed for the agenda of environment, public health and protecting water resource. That's how it should be. And the tariff shouldn't be based on what people are happy about, but based on affordability, what people can afford to pay, and where the government need to come in to provide the support. So this is how this sector will operate. So a bit of on the tariff. In Malaysia, 26 years ago, the tariff had been put in place. For domestic services, for 26 years, tariff didn't change. Even though our currency have really become much weaker since then, but tariff never changed. It's still 8 ringgit a month for connected services. And commercial tariff actually gone down 3 times due to unhappiness by commercial customers as they are paying very high tariff to subsidize the low tariff of the residential customers. So that is one component of it. So you can see that 87% are domestic accounts and 8.6% are commercial accounts. These 8.6% plus government's annual subsidy are actually compensating the low tariff the 87% of the residential customers are paying. Another component is in 2009, Department of Environment, I think here we call it Pollution Control Board, have came up with new regulation. There is a need to treat phosphorus and nitrate. That requires non-mechanized facilities to be upgraded. So when the non-mechanized facilities are upgraded, you can see actually the operation expenditure shot up. 40% of the expenditure for the operator is actually electricity. And non-mechanized facility actually being closed down like aerated lagoon and OPs because of that reason, number one. Number two is because the land becomes so expensive. So for them to convert this OP land to a mechanized facility and redevelop that particular piece of land. So hence, there is a benefit on one angle, but that benefit doesn't translate to the sector. When the land is being developed, the assessment or whatnot goes to the consolidation fund or state fund or federal fund. Doesn't come into the sewerage fund to redevelop sewerage facilities or even to compensate the low tariff. Only the industrial accounted customers tariff break even the operation cost. And you can see the industrial account customers are only 0.1%. So 0.1% of the people are actually paying what they're supposed to pay. 87.5% is paying extremely low, compensated by 8.6% of the commercial account. That is a snapshot of the industry right now, the good and the bad. We go on the evolution of regulatory landscapes. There are multiple regulatory entities and legislative tools in relation to sewerage sector, but we will focus specifically on the services aspect, which is number one. The agency is SPAN, National Water Services Commission. SPAN is actually acronym for a Malay word, Suruhanjaya Perkhidmatan Air Negara. And there are two legal tools. One is Water Services Industry Act, another one is SPAN Act. Water Services Industry Act actually talks about how the industry should be regulated and enforced. SPAN Act is what is the functions and obligation of the regulator. So that's what both acts are. So I will not cover the other acts unless you have an interest on it. You can actually ask the questions later. Sorry. So the evolution of institutional structure, you can see at the bottom bit, I put there protecting public health, protecting water resources and environment. If you really can see, that's how the transition actually took place in Malaysia to where it is now, which is at the last column. So initially, the sewage sector is under state control because before the federal constitution changes it and put under concurrent list. And even the ministries that having control, the regulator who are putting up the capital expenditure is largely related to those who are controlling the public health or have a say in the public health or interest in it. So you can see it is actually governed by either Ministry of Health and federal government. However, when population started migrating to urban area, I think somewhere early 1980s, when the government approach is no more agriculture, they are pushing toward manufacturing industry, people are moving to urban areas. So then it became more concerned of protecting water resources as the growth is expanding out, the urban area were expanding out to water catchment areas. So in fact, some of the water intake points are sitting smack right at the point where the industrial zone are. So there's a need to change. So that's how you can see the migration of the power to federal government. The regulator is being changed. So I think these slides will be shared, right? So I will not go into line by line. It'll get really boring. So you can actually read it at your own leisure if you enjoy it. So this is how you can see the migration and finally going to protecting of the environment, because right now it sits under the Ministry of Water, Land and Natural Resources. How more perfect can it get? So that is the right agency to be in. And Natural Resources here is a federal agency that has some form of control on the rivers. Two components in Malaysia that will never go to federal government, or at least I can't imagine going to federal government, is land and river. Because Malaysia also have some form of royalties influence when it comes to matters related to land and sewerage. So every state has their own royalty, so that's not something they will actually give up. But federal government has a say in creating uniformity in the way they actually manage those practices. So that sits under this particular ministry, which is initially was Ministry of Energy, Water and Communication. Last year they changed it to finally to Ministry of Water, Land and Natural Resources. So that is pulled up under one. Okay, this is based on current framework, giving you a snapshot from the point of where the water is being abstracted at the catchment, at the river, to a point where it's returning back to the river. Who are the players? Who has the regulatory role? And what are their regulatory role? Who has the operational role? And who are the capital works implementer? So this is actually to give a snapshot based on current setup. Okay, so I don't think I will run through this. This probably okay. I will share this particular slide. This is actually separation of power. This is giving a bit more detail, explaining the diagrammatic view. So there are four bodies. One is federal government, state government, National Water Resource Council chaired by the Prime Minister, and National Water Services Commission, where all the regulatory matters sits. When come to the other three, federal government, which is water, land and natural resources, look into policy matters. State government is raw water, because anyone who want to abstract any single drop, either surface or ground, need to get the abstraction license, otherwise it's an offense. And then you have National Water Resource Council. This is chaired by the Prime Minister, especially when there is a transboundary issue, disputes, or grey area. Because it's always, because one is under state power, under federal constitution, the other one is under federal power. So that council is not really a body, it actually sits when there is a requirement. So having the separation of governance and whether really the roles are separated is another matter, probably I will discuss later. But based on the structure, it is very clear who has what role. But sometimes when day-to-day operation comes in, and when people do not have clear understanding why each one has separation of these particular roles, then some confusion can take place and people started doing someone else's work rather than theirs. So that's something that we will touch on a bit later. The way National SPAN actually established their regulatory framework is based on 4 pillars, which is economic, technical, consumer and social. In the later 2 slides, I will actually share with you how extensive the regulatory component has been established. I'm not recommending that, but it's really extensive to a point is we will call it heavy command and control. When it comes to economic, they issue licenses, they look into 3-year business, rolling business plan, 30-year business plan, viability of that particular operator, where he's going to get his capital funds for his 3 years and 30 years, how he's going to recover, what kind of tariff they request, all those details, including procurement policies that they're going to adopt. So that means if they do not adopt certain kind of competitive bidding and procurement policies, their tariff may not be considered. This is how they actually go about when it comes to economic pillar. Technical pillar is selection of infrastructure. What type of infrastructure do you select? What is the location of that selection? Is it necessary or not? What kind of design? What is the strategy being employed? Is it going to be an ultimate capacity at this present moment of time, or does it require to be done in module based on the growth of that area? So those kind of details. Quality of infra, what are the design processes, equipment, quality of construction, standards, and this will come under technical ambit. You have consumer, the consumer standards has been established, quality of services, rates and deposits, what are the minimum expectations or client charter and operator need to abide by. So this falls under consumer. Provision of information and transparency, not the best, but there is a lot of information being shared and published on SPAN website, as well as documents that SPAN actually publishes. When it comes to social pillar, they're talking about contribution funds. They have Sewerage Capital Contribution Fund, Water Industry Contribution Fund. Water Forum is a forum that is actually funded by the regulator to create, in Malaysia, we do not have vibrant civil society organizations like how is it in India. So it's quite limited. So government actually, the regulator actually gives a budget for these CSOs to mature and to a point where they will actually sit in the public consultation, going through the business plans and going through the tariff that is being proposed. So this is what is expected out of Water Forum and the rest. I will not touch on Water Industry Fund, but if you're interested later in the questions, I will answer. But Sewerage Capital Contribution Fund, I'll share in the later slide. Basically, this is a snapshot when it comes to what are the main functions, unit processes, and components involved, and who are the stakeholders that has been captured when it comes to the regulatory framework that SPAN has established. I will not go detail on this because I've actually established two matrices when it comes to the services as well as capital funding. So you can actually see that in the matrices, where and how they are being regulated. So in Malaysia setup, in order to have holistic regulation, these are the 8 components that are being covered. One is how the services are being financed, the equitable tariff pricing, how the tariff is being priced, the O&M works, who are the players, what are the competency required for the players that is allowed to participate in the industry, the quality of the constructions, so there are issuance of permits, requirement that is being imposed on competency, requirement being imposed on their capital or formation of their company, where they can actually operate. So which state they are allowed to operate. So those are actually being regulated and permits are being issued. Products, material and quality, as well as performance of the products and suppliers, design of infra works and type of infra works. These are, when we say regulation, I think in one of the slides I will share, regulation is not necessarily means there is a document that is being published, enacted by law, and if it's not being followed, then they are taken to court or compound or something like that. Regulation can be done in various mechanisms. So for example, it can be a contract, it can be a licensing, it can be a condition attached to a permit being issued. So there's various ways how regulatory function works. It's not regulation as per the laws alone. That's not the only thing. Because like it or not, regulation or establishing this kind of mandatory tools is hindrance to the economy and business. So while certain things need to be put on control, it shouldn't be so overwhelming that it stifles the growth or the economic participation in the industry. So that is where the regulator need to establish the balance. Some brief description on how SPAN as a service regulator function in Malaysia. I would say they are reasonably autonomous, not very autonomous, reasonably autonomous, because they still report to the minister. It's not that they are not reporting to the parliament. However, the board has 12 commissioners. There are maximum of 5 terms. Each term is about 2 years, unless the SPAN Act is revisited, which I'm not sure whether they will do that or not. And commission is actually self-funded through issuance of permit and licenses, so they do not get money from federal government. So there's some form of autonomous activity that they can conduct. However, they still report to the minister. So there are some check and balance or control on that aspect. When come to accountability, Commission can sue and can be sued. That means Commission is actually held accountable for their actions or inactions. Not that anyone have sued. I think there are 2 or 3 cases, but I think it was ruled in favor of the Commission. But I wouldn't say Malaysia has very robust challenge system on the regulator as of yet. I mean, people do not really challenge regulators as much. So I guess that is something that, is it? I thought in India they get challenged very frequently, but not in Malaysia. So, but I guess as people get more educated and more aware, so regulators need to be on their toe. The law actually allows the regulator to form a tribunal that is actually comprises of magistrates and people from judiciary to resolve disputes among the regulated stakeholders, between permit holders and licensees, between licensees. So there is powers that has actually been given. I think the rest I will not go through, but the fact is there is a SPAN Act that describes what regulators accountable, what are their functions, means if they don't carry that out, they can be questioned. A lot of time when come to government departments, which is not wouldn't really call as a regulated entity, they tend to disappear in the midst of hundreds of other government departments function. So the possibility of holding them accountable is very difficult. So unlike when you have a regulatory agency. So this is the metrics I was talking about. Maybe we will not talk about the sewage-based sanitation infrastructure. We can talk about the bottom one, on-site sanitation infrastructure. So the sub-markets here is on-site sanitation facility like septic tank, pit latrines or small sewage treatment systems in Malaysia. We also, the other part is dislodging services, treatment of fecal sludge and reuse. So what you can see here is under the functions of financing, planning and design, construction and O&M, the boxes that is filled up with the names like government or private developers, operators or professionals, these are the entities that are responsible for that particular function, for that relevant infrastructure. So here on the capital works part, some are, you can see regulators heavily involved. In some section is private developer. In Malaysia, the funding dynamics is very interesting. Sewerage infrastructure is funded by private developers and handed over at no cost to the appointed operator by the government. Based on some calculation that we have done, for every 1 ringgit government spends on sewage infrastructure, 3 ringgit is spent by the private sector. So this is how it works in Malaysia. Well, that is amazing, that is fantastic. That means things can move, right? Because if relying 100% on, it sounds bad, even though I'm from a regulator, but I dare to acknowledge the fact that leaving everything for government to actually run and function means you must have the patience to wait for another 30 years for something that is supposed to have yesterday, right? So there is a check and balance required in that. So when come to Malaysia, the speed is due to that, but the challenges also due to that. For example, when private developer construct, they construct for their development need, right? So that means you end up with a lot of treatment plants. So, but at the same time, there is also showing weakness in the framework. What worked 26 years ago, having the small treatment plants, every 150 population, a treatment plant is required. There was a standard rule of thumb that is applied in Malaysia. For every 150 people, 1 treatment plant should be provided. One, it worked fantastic at a point where 150 people living in one designated area was not many. But now when you have millions of people living in one particular area, but the developers are not putting up a development serving 1 million. They're putting up development serving 300 people, 400 people, 500 people, and every month putting up this infrastructure. That means the funds actually get diluted and disintegrated. The use of fund is not managed in a way it can bring back future benefit. So there was the weakness. And if you look into the services aspect, you can see SPAN's name mentioned everywhere. So this is where I said it's heavy command and control aspect of it. So literally every single aspect is controlled, again, because of the funding mechanism where the private developer funds it, he constructs, he designs, he constructs, and then he hands over. That means regulators are generally very risk averse. So that means they want to know who you appoint. So I'm going to make sure you only appoint people that are issue permit. How you design, you can only design the processes based on the guideline that are produced. What products are you using? You can only use the products from the suppliers that I have approved and registered. So that's where the control comes in. So this is not necessary if the framework changes. This is only necessary because of the dynamics in Malaysia. So I always, my concern is sometimes when, who do not like power, right? So sometimes this looks so powerful and it's not that good if it goes on for a very long period, unless in that particular framework, when it's established, the policy framework says this approach we will actually use for 10 years and then things going to change. When that doesn't happen, forever, I do not know anybody who sits in power do not want power unless they get pushed out of that chair, right? So unless it's already mandated in the policy document that this approach is going to be taken for the next 10 years, after that must change, the deregulation takes place, then you will have high command and control with no efficiency and effectiveness at all. So in Malaysia, when I was still with the regulator, I have pushed for certain deregulation initiatives as well, simplifying certain processes by simple fact that 26 years after someone have designed and construct a facility, I believe they have learned a lot. So that means regulators should be able to, and regulators didn't do the design and construction, so the likelihood is they have matured in this particular sector. There should be sort of a deregulation component to let them flourish. You want good people in the industry. There are also components, okay, when it comes to heavy command and control, one thing that have been introduced, I guess everywhere, definitely in India as well, is regulatory impact assessment. So regulatory impact assessment, if it's done in a proper way, will actually give the regulator a clear picture what kind of tools or framework they have to establish if it is necessary in the first place. For example, in my own personal experience, some of the draft regulations that I have seen when it comes to dislodging shows is highly procedural. I do not know whether there's much beneficial outcome can be derived out of it, because I actually felt it's a bit too procedural. So what dislodging regulation that I have read, some of the draft regulations that I've read here that was produced in India, it had become highly procedural. If you actually go on using regulatory impact assessment, what is the impact of every single sentence you put in that regulation will actually give you an idea whether that is required. If it's required, whether that is the right approach. That's one way. Another thing is, when I was with the regulator, some of the approach that I have actually looked at is regulation by incentive. That means in certain areas, my focus area at that point of time is resource recovery. That means reusing of effluent and biosolids. Incentives or rebates to be given for them to participate rather than mandating it through law. Nobody likes, let's face it, right? The chances is we want someone else to follow the law, but we ourselves do not really like to follow. And then I think now millennials are even better. My son tells me, rules are made to be broken, so I'm going to break it, you see. So this is how it is, because they are more, actually I feel they are more aware. They question, which is good. And normally, if a regulator unable to answer, what is the purpose of that, that means it's a good time to say it should be removed. That is my opinion. Okay, as I mentioned, there are different types of regulatory design that can be applied, whether it's a legal instrument or through organizations. Earlier in the matrix, I have put the word professionals. In the capital works aspect of it in the matrix earlier, I put the word professional. Professional here means either board of engineer or board of architects or the board of surveyors, depending on the scope, actually oversees the code of conduct or ethics of their professionals within their board. Because regulator only allow people who are recognized by the board to carry out these functions. So regulator relies on these professional bodies to actually regulate their own people. So similarly, organization can be used to actually regulate their own members. even when come to associations, professionals associations as well. For example, permit holders. Otherwise, the entire association can actually face the consequence of not being recognized by the regulator anymore. So the likelihood of an association picking up a stick on their own member is higher. Otherwise, the entire group will actually face the consequence. So there is various ways. One is through organizations, multiple ways. Another one is through legal instruments, and legal instruments not necessarily statutes. In fact, I personally always feel statutes should be the last because it's very stifling, difficult to change, and sometimes when it is there, the chances it will change is like 60 years or after one generation leaves. So it's always based on context and license. Not that I'm not against regulation. It sounds strange if I'm talking about regulation saying that I'm against. I'm talking about the methods of regulation. So to allow dynamic change in the industry, contracts and license will be a good approach. I'll go into this particular case study, dislodging services regulatory framework. I guess that is very specific for the topic CPR is interested as well, and my experience in Malaysia. I want to give you a snapshot of some study that I have personally involved when I was in India Water. This first part is when I was in India Water as an operator. You can see that the septic tank for this particular river basin, Langat River Basin area, septic tank is served by the blue one. 12% of the population here is served by septic tanks, but they actually contribute 34% of the pollution. The pollution loading, the BOD loading. In terms of BOD, I'm only showing BOD chart here. In terms of BOD loading into this river, 12% is served by the septic tanks and pour flush, but they are actually contributing to 34% of the BOD loading into the river. While the public treatment plants are serving 83% of the population in this particular basin, and they are only contributing to 24% of the pollution loading. So a lot of time, when we want to go on the angle to the consumer that you need to be connected, connected is good. We are talking it is good for somebody else 10 years from now, not something that they can actually empathize or feel. Right? Because it's like, if you say something like, if you change, your house value will go up. If you connect, if you close your septic tank, connect to a public treatment plant, or you must dislodge every 2 years or every 3 years, your property value will go up. Your assessment will go low. The local council will charge lower. They will do some free maintenance for your house or paint it every 2 years. Then, yes, it works. If you want to get them to connect to a public system if it's available, or if you want to get them to dislodge every 2 to 3 years. Right? But what you can see here is the benefit is for somebody else in distant future. So the need for them to change or to adopt these changes voluntarily doesn't happen. The environment doesn't even allow that. Personally, if you ask me, I'll be very honest. If someone asks me, Punita, if you change, if you dislodge a connect, just incur 10,000 ringgit and connect, you're going to do good for next generation. I'll say, okay, fine. I'm not the only one anyway, so there's so many people have to do it, right? So what's the point? So let's be frank and honest here. Second thing is, if you see, when come to the pollutant loading comparison, the first 3 bars is septic tank within 1 year, septic tank within 2 years and 3 years. Followed up by, the dark one is communal septic tank, the shorter blue one is EA, extended aeration. Can you see what is the loading like? That's the reason dislodging need to be done. Despite the septic tank is designed for 2 years, dislodging should be done within 2 to 3 years. Because you can see how the growth is, especially on the COD and oil and grease chart. So the one thing is the data. Having data is essential. Second thing is making decision based on practicality. Previously in Malaysia, the dislodging is every 2 years once. And that means the need to have so many tankers and so many permit holders that is very high that the country cannot cope. I mean, the industry unable to grow in that speed. So when this particular study is done, it shows that it's not necessarily 2 years. 3 years is fine too. No, because you can see that in the 3rd year where the tipping is, actually they have done across a several number of years and the tipping is at the 3rd year. So that is being practical. Maybe environmentalists wouldn't like it, but taking a regulatory role means you have to be practical. I will skip this particular slide, this detail on the Act, because I'll cover it here. Still talking on the dislodging. Before 1993, dislodging was done based on demand. Currently, dislodging is done based on schedule. Okay, this scheduled dislodging was rolled out after it moved to federal government, because federal government in Malaysia is a highly federal government control. That means laws can be put in place, agencies can be put in place. Therefore, scheduled demand has been rolled out. And you can see, if scheduled demand is not rolled out, earlier I have showed you 500,000 complaints or inquiries, less than 10% actually call for dislodging services. People who call for dislodging services are those who have been inconvenienced by the septic tank and need dislodging. That means the people who actually demand for it is only 10%. By right, annually, they should dislodge 33%. It's every 3 years once, means 33% of the septic tank must be dislodged, but only 10% is asking for it. So you can see the impact when it comes to the environment. So demand is out of desperation, schedule is what you need if you want to talk about water resource and environment. And a lot of campaigns has been done. 14 years dislodging was performed up to 2008. Before the liberalization concept was kicked in. The liberalization concept means it's still scheduled dislodging, but it's not mandated on India Water to do the dislodging. India Water is a national concession company, and now until 2008, after 2008, they said that services can be given by India Water or any permit holder that SPAN had approved. And the obligation is on the house owner to call and make this request. And from then on, from 100,000 plus accounted customers dislodging annually, the number dropped to 20,000. This is the impact of liberalization. There was certain flaw to the assumption that has been made on the liberalization concept. I think I'll come to the other part later. I just want to finish this slide. And you can see the rates that was proposed. Before 2008 is 6 ringgit a month. So the dislodging to be done every 2 years, so total is 144 ringgit. But when come to after 2008, 3 years one is the dislodging requirement. And the rate is only 40 cents more a month. One-time payment 230 ringgit. So actually the increased tariff per month is not high. But when the dislodging is done, instead of 24 months, it's 36 months. That means the impact on the operator is significantly reduced, that they can actually sustain based on the same rate. Okay, this is where I say the assumption, based on my point of view, the assumption was flawed on liberalization concept. First is the basis of liberalization is IWK was not interested in dislodging business due to the problem that is listed below. All this refusal of the owner, cannot access, cannot find, cover cannot open, owner is not there, but whatnot. Second, the cost of dislodging by IWK is high, hence high refusal rate. You can see that the green is before 2008, the green line is the attempted dislodging by India Water Consortium, and blue is the number of the attempts that is unsuccessful, red is number they managed to dislodge. So it was assumed that so many people do not dislodge or do not allow the access or whatnot because the rates by IWK is high. So by introducing competition or alternative options to the septic tank owners, which is approved permit holders, the rates will come down. So people will actually want to do the dislodging. And the alternative options is to bring the dislodging cost lower, which nobody actually agreed. So what they have made, one big fundamental here, what they have made an assumption here is, after 14 years of dislodging, 1993 to 2008, people have learned what is dislodging, they will want to do dislodging, it is an accepted norm. That is one fundamental flaw that was accepted. This is my point of view, it's not like proven fact, but unless someone can point I'm wrong, I tend to say I'm right, so in this particular aspect. It took 14 years to get an awareness to build up to 100,000 people accounts dislodged a year, and it took stroke of midnight to bring it down to 20,000. So for me, I think the fundamental flaw is assuming people is aware. I think people are aware in general. I think people are good in general. I just think people are forgetful. How many of us remember what we eat yesterday? What more remembering 3 years ago you have done? Not something that is like a birthday anniversary that you have to remember, or else you're in trouble. This is not that scenario. So this is one fundamental flaw when it comes to the liberalization model. So that is one part of the aspect. I'll share with you another part. Okay, the actual issue is wrong framing of the problem. The problem is not right. The problem is IWK didn't get the support from the regulator for people who didn't do the dislodging. I think that is the problem. Because IWK have listed a lot of problems, right? They said owner refused, location not accessible, septic tank covers are sealed, owners didn't appear when they're supposed to appear on site, septic tank cannot be found, premises are not found, it's a non-standard septic tank. Is this the operator's problem? This is the regulator's problem. So what did regulator do about it? I think the framing of the problem was wrong. So the framing of the problem should have been what regulator can do to counter these issues that they have raised. Second is, okay, I've put the lack of regulatory support. Third is dependent on IWK's feedback rather than independent study by regulator. Okay, I'm a student of India Water. India Water has groomed a lot of people who are now currently sitting in regulator. So that means the knowledge, the skill, the competencies actually are with the operators. You know why? Because operators are private sector, they tend to grow fast and they grow aggressive compared to government, right? Government, they rely, not everyone, but most actually rely on the power rather than competency and skills. So the chances is here they grow very fast, here they don't grow as fast. That means what they say can influence the regulator's decision. So what IWK want to do at that point of time, they have framed the problem wrongly, or maybe they framed the problem right, but they can't move the regulator to do what they're supposed to do, so they say that I do not want to do this, just let it go. So that's one thing. Another thing is permit holders being unhappy. Why permit holders being unhappy with India Water? Because India Water make it difficult for them to discharge in the nearest disposal centers. So the disposals are actually being, the permit holders are being sent to far away locations. So there's a lot of grievances when it comes to permit holders. Is the time? Okay. So impact of liberalization. Based on independent study by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, if revenue declines by 5%, the IRR plunges to 0. For small, medium-scale operators, within 2 years, and large-scale operator within 5 years will not be able to make any profits in this particular sector. 96% of the respondents feel 250 ringgit is too high for dislodging services, even though they have earlier paid. If you equate it per month, they already paid that amount. That means when they pay every month for 3 years 250 ringgit, it's not a problem. When you ask them to pay one time 250 ringgit, it's a challenge. Okay. So other issues that I personally face when I want to reignite dislodging regulatory framework is 15 years worth of work undone. So people felt that 15 years, if no scheduled dislodging was done properly and we are surviving, we can continue to survive. But that can be seen, I didn't share the graph here, but can see with the depletion of river quality, water quality. Enforcement action must be taken on 340,000 premises annually if this approach is still taken up, and conflicts within community, especially on connected CSTs, communal septic tanks. So previously was done by the independent entity, which is operator. Now the community need to come together, sign contract, share the cost. That created a lot of community issues and problems, conflicts. We have done a detailed analysis when it comes to the costing, and we find that some of the functions shouldn't even be done by the operator, can be outsourced. Because if you can see, the light green boxes is actually the cost that we have come up. When I was in SPAN, we actually came up with an extensive analysis on the costing incurred by operator, and we came up, these are the percentage of the cost incurred by the operator for different sections of the dislodging activity. And we find that if the dislodging works, which is operating the vehicles, transporting the sludge, is done by a third-party contractor, then the cost can reduce even further. because the depreciation of the tankers, which is within 5 years, can be taken away from the operator. Hence, the tariff can be kept. Detail on this aspect. This is various tariff structure option that we have put up. And option 3 was what has been proposed, which is volumetric charges, the same as connected services to septic tanks. Okay, one fundamental principle I had when I want to push for this was, I do not know what they are doing now, it's still a stalemate. Whether it's a septic tank with scheduled dislodging or connected services, it is just the type of services differs, but the eventual output is the same, which is treatment of sewage, right? So that means why it should be 2 different tariffs. When it 2 different tariffs give an indication, one have to be cheaper than the other. And likelihood is, in a layman's mind, septic tank should be cheaper because it's not connected to a treatment plant. But we all know the cost that septic tank has, if it's not emptied at a frequent interval, and the logistics and the treatment of fecal sludge is actually far more expensive. The net cost is actually far more expensive for septic tank. Because you have logistics, you have transportation costs, you have fecal sludge to be treated. For example, in Malaysia, sewage BOD is designed for 250, but the actual part is 180. It's very diluted. Fecal sludge you can never get at 180, it's far higher. So the treatment required is different. If you go on scheduled dislodging, not demand dislodging maybe 10-15 years once. Scheduled dislodging, every 2 to 3 years you have to do dislodging. So the actual net cost and the impact on the environment, because septic tank is actually partial treatment, not full treatment, is actually higher if you go to the net cost. I've never done any analysis, but based on some of the data that we have. So for that reason, we said push one single tariff for sewage services. Just like we do not differentiate if the connected services is being treated by an oxidation pond or by a membrane system, has the same tariff, why this must be differentiated. That also gives some kind of changing social perspective. When a regulator go to public consultation twice, then people have this idea that they are increasing the tariff twice, not for 2 different services. What you'll have in mind is you just came last year for sewage tariff, and now you're asking increase again. So you see, a lot of time what goes around in social media, once it goes, and the momentum that builds up, right, cannot be controlled. So this is where sewage tariff a lot of time never really went up. So why not have one single tariff based on volumetry? That also encourages people to use less water, because in Malaysia the water consumption is very high. Despite it's reported about 230 liters per person per day, for one particular area that have done a study, it shows 320. Because houses not occupied is pretty high. So that's one component of it. However, the biggest challenge is when we put up this proposal, one thing is the scheduled dislodging services must be planned and implemented by public operators. Regulators must take action on the owners who refuse the services. Creation of vendor program. Operator need to create a vendor program to create businesses for permit holders and get permit holders on board to actually compensate. Because at that point of time, my approach was operators shouldn't buy any more tankers, because that is going to depreciate and more cost to the operators. Tariff concept is based on water usage with the same tariff structure as the connected services, which will deliver 40, because right now dislodging services, 43% of revenue from the dislodging services was used to compensate connected services. They're making a lot more money on dislodging services. So we said that this can be balanced up. Unsuccessful trip of the dislodging tanker must be paid. Any trips where it has been mobilized to the site and then refused, payment will be charged as usual. Payment will be done on monthly basis. Pricing policy under principle of user pay to encourage efficient use of water. Same regulation and implementation date for both connected and dislodging. That means really removing the differentiation between dislodging and connected. That's the approach that I pushed up. And to minimize impact on tariff increase, government to continue subsidize operators until the tariff can be rolled up in 2 or 3 cycles that it matches the OPEX cost. I'll skip this. I'll go on the, I think I'll just this is a funding model I touched earlier. In Malaysia right now, they're using asset-light funding model. That means there's an agency created, there's a company created by Ministry of Finance. They will actually hold all the liabilities and assets of water infrastructure. So operators' role is to lease these particular assets and carry out operation functions. This is an asset-light model concept. But for sewerage, nobody dare to take up the asset owner responsibility because of the current debt of 2 billion. So nobody want to take the asset light model role. The existing model that's still being used is, as I mentioned earlier, it is a heavily developer funded, and some parts of it is actually government funded. This is the allocation for sewerage, which is the red line. You can see only happens in RMK 5 onwards. So literally you can't see how much government have actually funded for sewerage, because that is how much government has funded for sewerage, the red lines. That's it, what government funded. This is what private has funded, the orange, the brown, that is what private has funded. So in Malaysia, it was really mostly private funded. I want to give you a snapshot. Based on current approach and goals, 50 billion is needed for the next 30 years, means 1.7 billion a year. But government is actually barely giving about 250 million to West Malaysia. This calculation is for West Malaysia. 250 million a year, roughly what is government allocating. That means there is a significant deficit of what government is giving compared to what is needed. So that's where the private funding through contribution funds is essential. Otherwise, this will not, sewerage sector in Malaysia will not be able to progress. I think I'll skip this. I'll go to lessons learned. Yeah. Okay, takeaway points. Should rely on data and facts, because a lot of time people make decisions based on their opinions, but when you actually look at the data, frame the problem right, you will see a different angle. So must rely on facts and data. Effective, sufficient and meaningful consultation with all stakeholders in drafting and implementation. A lot of time consultation exercise is just left as an advocacy or a formality. It's a checklist. So that approach should be done away with and must do proper consultancy. Depoliticize segments that are politically sensitive. Unload this pressure of the political masters, especially when it comes to tariff pricing. Should take it away from politicians, put it on the regulator. Because as long as sitting on the politicians, this kind of sensitive matters, they will not be able to make the decisions, and they can't. Create vibrant environment to attract private sector. There is not a single problem, my opinion, a government face can be resolved with government solution alone. So private sector participation must be leveraged to accelerate the growth. But how well that private sector participation is designed depends on how smart is the government. So it must be designed so that it's not heavy on the private sector side. It must be balanced. Identify industry and sectoral champion, essential to drive the sector forward. Start somewhere is better than not starting at all. So demand dislodging is better than no dislodging at all. Procedures are not regulatory objectives and outcomes. Strategic structural changes, I think all this you are fully aware, I will not go on that. Enforcement, compound someone is good, sending someone behind the bars is better. Everyone has laws, not that I'm saying we turn to dictatorial country, but no point having laws and tightening the laws every year in and out, but have no interest in actually implementing it. So laws is there to be implemented, otherwise my suggestion is just do away with the law, repeal that law. Competency building, so the rest I guess you have to read it because time is short.
Queries and questions. Okay, I will introduce yourself and then ask.
I'm Yogesh Sharma, former advisor for Namami Gange, and before that I was the director in NRCD Ministry of Environment. I have been involved with this sector for a very long time, like most of my life. So I am very curious because your presentation was very nice, but somehow or the other I am quite confused because it's quite different from our system. What I wanted to know is, the city councils have no role in planning for sewerage. In India, urban development is the key which decides on things. But there is a lot of unchecked urban development also going on, in which case then political solutions are found and eventually schemes are made to retrofit those kind of habitation, which is of course a very messy business. But here the government is involved, so it's different. But in Malaysia, you said it is the private sector which takes the lead. Now, how does the private sector find it viable to actually fund the sewerage sector and then be able to recover its money, because they must be taking finance from a bank or some financial institution. So even if the government is putting in a bit of support for the viability gap funding, how is it that the private sector is able to actually recover its money when the private sector is not able to recover its money in the sewage sector anywhere in the world? Not only in India, everywhere the government eventually has to step in and support the local services, what is known as the council in your country or what is known as the municipal services here. I think the recent example everybody will remember was of Detroit going bust and Chicago going bust. So the local councils, the tertiary government in most countries are actually the weakest. So how is it that in Malaysia the private sector is actually so vibrant that it is able to finance the sewage sector and still continue, and the government really doesn't have to step in except that the regulator is able to do this thing? That part I am not very clear. Can you please try to amplify? Maybe my understanding is not much about it.
Sure. We can take 2-3 questions and then you can start.
Mine is linked to yours.
Okay.
Very linked.
Very fine.
So this is what, thank you so much. This is what we were looking for. I'm Urvashi, I'm the wash advisor and the director of a small company called Practical Action Consulting India Private Limited, which has made, in my view, and I will invite you along with CPR India, which is here, a state-of-the-art FSTP in Helkanan, a small municipality in Odisha. I'm just back from the field, so I have a lot of inputs on this. And by the way, I want to thank Malaysia government for this, because the model we have now grounded, including it's reached the stage of composting from fecal sludge, which is in the market, is from Malaysia. So Anjuji from CPR is our partner on that. So my questions are from the ground. I will link it to Yogeshji's question. One is from get her name. Punita. The other factor I wanted to ask, that practical action works for the poorest, the least, and the last. So generally the private sector participation and their interest in any sewerage or any system is for profits. So how do you deal with these slums, these small pockets where even the sewerage is not able to reach, of course it's not able to reach, but even the desludging services are not able to reach. So my question is linked to Yogeshji's question. But then that is one question. The other, the linked question is, you talk about the social aspect of dealing with this. And the other question very specifically is your model about sewerage versus fecal sludge treatment plants. And what the hypothesis you made was that maybe sewerage is more cost effective. And in my view, whatever we're implementing in Henderson, this model, the desludging, scheduled desludging itself and the fecal sludge treatment plant, which is by the way gravity based, it's not based on electricity, is much more cost effective maybe than the so-called centralized systems which are being experimented in the country. So these two questions. Yeah, please.
Can you talk about how the desludging is done? Because that's the whole human issue here. I mean, is it mechanized? How is it done? Is it done by people? Is it, all that?
One question here, then we can take. Punita, you can respond to these 4 questions. Just next to me.
My name is Raghav from the World Bank. I work with Water Global Practice. Thanks a lot for this presentation. So as you said, information is very key. Data, you mentioned about data requirement. information is key for regulation, right? So who collect the data, whether it is a local body or other ministries, etc. That is one issue. Second one is communication with the public is also another important factor to get their ownership. How do you do that?
Yes, okay. So I'll go on the first question first on private sector financing. Private sector financing comes for capital works, not for services. Services is actually from tariff and government subsidy. This is where the services funds comes in. For capital works, when private sector actually finance, in Malaysia, the way infrastructure is being developed, it's interlinked. There are some other slides which is not, I didn't put in this particular deck. It's leveraging on policies of other sector. In Malaysia, the way they have leveraged on is housing policy. When come to housing policy, I think I'll answer together on the poor aspect of it. Government actually put up certain requirement. When any developers, real estate developers put up houses or subdivide the land to put houses. I do not know whether the method will be the same as in India. So I'm talking about Malaysian method there. When they subdivide and change the land conversion, land use, as well as once they change land use to building and put up building, they have to get approval from not just local authority but many other agencies. And this regulator is one of the agencies, they must get approval before they get a development order, they can go to the bank to secure funds. So all these agencies, including land, water and sewerage, roads, energy, telecommunication, all these external technical agencies, input must be taken into consideration and the developer need to cost it into his development. So once he cost it in, only then he can actually get development order for them to secure loans from the bank. Because without development order, no banks will give them loans. And how they recover is through the sales of the property. Because all the cost has been built into the property prices. So that's how it is being recovered. So they actually recover almost immediately the moment they sell off the property. Okay, that's one part. Linking it to your question on poor, because government also requires certain development of certain size, a percentage of it must be constructed for poor. They call it low-cost housing. So this particular low-cost housing must be constructed at cost and handed over to the state. For state will actually do a balloting to the poor. Sorry. So in that case, there is no differentiation on the infrastructure or the services poor receives. It is the same. Because there is no, when come to evaluation by these agencies, when come to electricity, telecommunication, water and sewerage, it is not based on the affordability. The technical component of it remains the same for all. But the tariff that actually gets imposed on them is actually based on what is the classification. If it's low-cost housing, for sewerage it's only 2 ringgit a month, which is 20 cents more than the posting cost. So this is how the costing works. So the recovery is through the property prices. Next is the question on fecal sludge versus connected services. I am talking from Malaysia angle, so Dan Canal have to see how Dan Canal experience is, and I think Dan Canal treatment plan, I was just talking to Anju and Ambrish. It's so huge, I think can fit into football field, 3 football fields. Yes, that is, if someone finds that piece of land in Malaysia, they will use every lobby group to buy that land to put up a condominium. So that's what will happen. So the thing is, when I make this analogy of fecal sludge going to be more expensive, there are 2 ways of calculating the cost. One way is actually capital and operation cost. Another one is regulatory and environmental cost. Actually, in this, there's one particular slide. I mean, if you like it, you can look at it and ask me more questions when you have the time, because we are short of time. The 2 components is environmental cost and regulatory costs that normally will not take into consideration. Imagine what is the cost of regulating 10,000 treatment plants compared to 2 million septic tanks. Because ensuring that the septic tank is actually dislodged, septic tank is properly sized, functioning, the permit holders who are running around are actually taking from the plant, taking from the household to the property, so there is a cost to it. So analysis must be done. When come to this particular dynamics, that I put this is something that I call SISCA, Sewerage Infrastructure Selection Criteria. It is actually dynamic to that particular area. So what is that area? What is the most suitable technology for that area? That yeah, it's just that even Malaysia, even though they approve it, but they haven't rolled it out. So it need to be developed further. But it's dynamic to the respective area. It's no one rule fit all. The biggest flaw, I mean, it's also a good thing at that point of time, but the biggest flaw I would say is after 26, almost 30 years, Malaysia held onto one way of doing things. 150 population equivalent and above must put up a treatment plant. So that is one way of doing things. Another thing is when I'm talking about tariff. When you want to price a tariff, you want to cause least resistance. You do not want people to be unhappy paying that tariff. So you wouldn't want to differentiate the tariff so much. This is something that I had in mind. I'm not saying it's going to work, but as one of the lessons I mentioned, better do something than doing nothing at all. Right now, people are not dislodging. The reason is the dislodging regulation and dislodging rules has not been firmed up, and there's a lot of dispute. Operator is making a lot of higher revenue, dislodging small group of people. Once this regulation comes on board, they will make reasonable revenue, but dislodging high group of people. So that's why there is a challenge there to create a balance. So that's why remove that whatever barriers that is possible from people. And then we can sort out government, can sort out politician, can sort out operators. So this is the angle I came from. Dislodging method. In Malaysia, there's only one way of dislodging. Everything is vacuum dislodging. They use vacuum tankers to do the dislodging. Vacuum tankers. Is highly regulated, not only by SPAN. There's another agency called SPAT, or now they call APAT, on the vehicle because it's a vacuum vehicle. And also, I think by Department of Safety and Health. So any kind of pressurized vehicles being used, Department of Safety and Health also will come into picture. Data collection and communication. Data collection is actually, before SPAN came on board, operators are already collecting the data. Once SPAN came on board, SPAN actually imposed more data requirement. Some of the data is actually transmitted either real time, daily basis or weekly basis to a system in SPAN. They call the system VBs. So all this data get actually migrated. So what kind of data is required is something that regulator will look at the business plan they're submitting, the KPIs that are being imposed. So that means that they want to get the data. The approach that at that point of time what I've taken is, you want to collect the data as frequently as possible to see end of the period whether they're performing or not. Not collecting the data end of the period to see whether they're performing or not. So because a lot of time when we collect data at the, like for example, it's a 3-year appointment, so annually we are collecting it. The data can be improvised. So you want to reduce the improvisation of the information. Regular collection of data is essential. Communication. Communication is generally, I do not know whether I'm answering a question on that, is generally through website, social media. Is that what you are requesting?
Community part, social.
Okay, there's two components here. One is public consultation for regulatory framework, amendment to the law, those kind of component. That is normally targeted stakeholders. So they will have workshops, close engagement. But really, this is depending on the officer in charge. Because it is mandated in the law, but it is a may, it's not a should. So when you come to may, some people may follow, some people may not follow, right? So it's really depending on the officer who handling that. Some will go extensive consultation and take time. One thing about consultation is it's going to take time. Okay, but the likelihood is you'll get a document that is well accepted and very thorough. But there is also, if the KPI is set, is within 3 months you have to come up with something, is how much consultation can you do, right? So that's another approach. But that is on the consultation part. When it comes to awareness and campaign, there is a reliance on Water Forum. As I mentioned, Water Forum is given certain budget. These are consumer people. These are activists who actually work closely with the community, with schools, villages, and all those things. So budget is actually given to them, so they will do a lot of such work. But when it comes to enforcement, if you actually go to SPAN Facebook site, they tend to share enforcement activity. For example, water theft is a criminal offense. So if someone steals the water operator complains to the regulator will go to the site to do raiding. So all those things get published. That's actually a form of creating awareness. So this is various mechanisms they use. Not the best, not sufficient. I wouldn't say it's sufficient, but I guess the last 1-2 years, they have increased such share of information.
But you don't have a regulation that is mandating that before a sewage system is put up, like in India we have, in certain cases that you have to have a community public meeting as per the Information Act, where if certain services being provided by the government or private, the communities or groups which are affected by it or are involved in it, their approval in writing or otherwise has to be there, otherwise it cannot be set up. That's what I think. You are saying that there's a regulation.
Okay.
But is there an enforcement?
They call it social impact assessment, right? Okay, there is, but it's not that many. As you see, most of the just not the budget component, government actually provide very small budget. This is the budget where existing treatment plants get connected and larger regional plants get constructed. These happen in an area where it's already populated. So social impact assessment is needed. When developer actually construct, there's nothing there. It's a greenfield. No, most of the private sector, because most of the funding comes from private sector, most of the facilities put up by private sector, they actually construct in a greenfield. They don't construct in a populated area. It's the green land they're putting up. So the need for social impact assessment or such requirement is not put in place. But for government projects, yes. They will actually do the social impact assessment, community participation, but I don't think a specific rule for it. I think it's a part of development requirement, and I don't think their approval is actually necessary. Yeah.
Take the mic, Isha. Let the mic come to you. He will not record it.
Cannot be recorded, is it?
What do you mean by that? What genre of regulations are you asking should be less? What are the regulations that you have already in Malaysia that you think tightening of them every now and then is actually leading to a adverse impact?
Okay, there was another case study that I put up, but later I removed because I did anticipate the time will be short. One regulation we had in Malaysia is Sewerage Works Approval or Planning, Design and Construction Rules. This particular regulation or the method of approval has been going on since 1990s. No one questioned it. Everyone adopt that thing, and every time there's an issue and come to planning, design and construction, more requirement has been put into this guideline, which later became regulation in 2013. Then ease of doing business came on board. That actually caused regulators to think deeper. What is the purpose? So when we actually analyze that particular, if I want to simplify that, when I actually analyze the regulation, I find that the entire objective of that regulation is to improve quality of sewage infrastructure. And when we actually analyze it, none of it actually delivers this output. It's very procedural, has no influence or impact on the quality. So that's where regulatory impact assessment comes on board.
You also mentioned that there are three genre of legal instruments that we should take care of instead of regulations. Contracts, licenses and statutes. To my understanding as a legal person, there is a lot of overlapping between these three legal instruments and the regulations that we normally have on board for any genre of services to be provided. For example, if you have desludging being done by private operators, these private operators, as again mentioned in one of the slides, are given a license by SPAN. I guess that's the authority out there. So license is a part of the regulatory framework. And if we have so much of private regulators flying around in the country, we do need a regulatory authority to manage or to ensure that they are doing work and not just working for the profit benefit, doing a social welfare work. That's what Sewerage is all about. So how do we balance that out there in Malaysia so that we can also implement a similar thing in India? Because right now, as Sir was pointing out, it's majorly the municipalities who are working, the local governments, local bodies. But if you want the private players to come into picture and we want less regulations, how do we do it?
I'm not saying that you must. Okay, it's not that you must have less regulation, but the regulation that you have must be meaningful, must bring the value. Otherwise, remove the regulation. If it's the kind of regulation that is that, see, a lot of time, not just regulatory body that I came from, but also other regulators, we have regulation, we have regulation. One of my former officers used a good quote, hiding behind the brown book, because in Malaysia the acts and the regulation is published in a brown book. So he said, hiding behind the brown book. What you have, I have a regulation. Have you ever implemented one case out of that? Did you take action on anybody? So a lot of time what will happen is regulation tend to be very input based. Someone need to have a license, but whether he behaving in accordance to the license, nobody cares. That means the regulation is not effective. So this is what I'm trying to say. And a lot of times such regulation tend to build up. Someone, out of 500 players, one person may do something that is not right. An additional clause will be put in place. Rather than taking action on that one person, it's like typical Pareto analysis. 80% of the time, people actually follow the law. 20% does not. But the laws actually designed, sorry, I know you're a lawyer, but lawyers tend to go and paint the 80% out of the 20% of the people who do not follow, rather than taking action on the 20%. So this is what I have seen from my own experience. You see, I'm one of those who really fight when it comes to planning, design, and construction rules, because I really thought there's a value to it. I remember fighting it out with the Malaysian Productivity Corporation, because I thought these people do not understand the sector, and I know better, and this is right, because I've been doing it for 20 years anyway. So it cannot be wrong. But when you actually remove that kind of prejudices, we step into regulatory impact assessment, we realize and have to admit, I realize and I have to admit, it didn't bring the value that I expected. 25 procedures that we put in actually translated to 96 procedures behind the scene. And eventually we reduced it to 2 procedures. Each manpower that is allocated to do the job, we can say 450 people were allocated to do the job. For each one of them, 14 days, working days, can be freed up. So this is what we find when we actually change the way the regulation, the rules are still there, but far more simplified and output based. So this is something that I'm trying to get at. So designing regulation is actually becomes a bit more complex, but it has a value. You can see some change. It's not like, just shouldn't go on procedures. I'm not saying India has too many regulations, but I can see a lot of complexity that is taking place. You know, like for example, I heard UK has this KPI imposed on one of their agency to remove 400 regulations a year. So I wonder how many thousands they have, right? And some of it has never been used at all.
So any more questions? 2 more. Also just to catch time, we are full and followed by. Any more? Which is the last round. Yeah, Ram, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Excellent presentation. One question, but before that, I just want to really congratulate you on your comment on this costs. See, this is something that we have never talked really about. The direct, indirect cost, regulatory cost, environmental cost, and the comment that you made, we should rely on facts and not really on opinions. And the opinion in the sector is generally that FSM is cheaper without really having any numbers. We don't really have the numbers. We are not talking about real costs. And this is really a good eye-opener for discussion, right? So what are we really talking about when we are saying that is cheaper or this is cheaper? And do we really have facts? So I really congratulate you for making it very, very straight. And my question was, like, when we are talking about this privatization in Malaysia in the sewerage sector, so the two first terms that come to my mind is, one is India Water Consortium and there is PAN. So what my question is, when we are talking about privatization or liberalization, so how is the private sector competition? Is there enough competition in the market? So India Water Consortium is a big name, but there is, because for the market, if you want to really benefit, so the competition is the first thing. So how is it really in Malaysia? Do you have enough competition, and how it is really well maintained?
So,
less but more meaningful regulation. And so I wanted to know your views on risk-based regulation, which I know Southeast Asia uses very, very effectively. I'm wondering if it's been tried in Malaysia at all. I had a second question related to what Raghava had asked before, and this was on data collection. You seem to imply that you rely on private sector for a lot of the data. Is that through data reporting? What are the checks that are sort of applied to the data? Because in India, there is an overwhelming inclination to think that all private sector data is unreliable and only government data holds any credibility. Whereas my personal opinion is that an operator has much greater stake in collecting the data that is relevant because his skin is in the game, right?
Hi, Punita. Thanks for a great presentation. So this is something that you talked about in your presentation, although I would have liked to hear much more about this. But just how these septic tanks that were there earlier or are prevalent even now are fairly non-standard, and sometimes these desludging operators have trouble finding them as well. So how did, as regulators, you come in and changed that situation to what it is now, where I suppose you have a lot more prefabricated system? What was the push that led to more effective regulation with respect to that? Was it just that desludging was being regulated, and so as an approach to that, you sort of like went further upstream and tried to fix the on-site sanitation systems? Or was it based on, you know, purely environmental concerns and mainstreaming of those concerns?
Okay, the first one is on the SPAN is the regulator, so they're not in competition with the operators. When it comes to India Water is actually a monopoly business. Depending on the thing is, if there is a regulator in the country, the best is regulator actually establishes what is the best model, how many operators can actually make it sustain. Creating, I'm not a big fan of monopoly, but I'm a very practical person. Okay, yeah, I'm a very practical person. I mean, of course, we will tend to think everything competitive is good, but I have just shared with you how the competitive doesn't work when it comes to this particular sector. But that doesn't mean the whole country or whole state or whole district need to have one operator. But it must be designed such a way that anyone who steps into this business must be able to sustain. The only way why IWK is sustaining right now is because it's a private company fully owned by Ministry of Finance. And Ministry of Finance is subsidizing these operations. I'm also working with one particular state where it is a state-owned company. They are forced to charge tariff as per IWK's tariff, but they do not get the subsidy. So literally, government have designed anyone else to fail by having such approach. And we also know different areas have different dynamics that will make the tariff differs. For example, in some area, the population density might be so great. The sewers and the tankers may not need to move very far. In some areas, different. So all these dynamics is essential for the regulator to make the necessary decisions. And then say that more than this is not the right number, because you cannot allow one person to operate in detriment to the other. Profits are regulated though. No one is allowed to have more than 10% profit. So it's not something that, it is for someone who's patient for long-term gains, not for short-term and high spikes of profit.
10% ban for every kind of operator.
No, 10%, double digit is the max time. So they are actually, when the business plan is reviewed, they are actually compensated based on their efficiency. Because previously was cost plus model. Cost plus model means the more cost they incur, the tariff will be. So that was not found very effective. So now it's different. They have regulated water accounting. The submission of their business plan must be based on regulated water accounting line item framework. Cost will be qualified, whether that particular cost qualified for tariff or not qualified for tariff. If something like having a political campaign or paying for a football club or something like that, all will be considered as non-qualifying costs. So they do not deserve tariff on that. And then what are the efficiency that they have put in place. So the efficiency gains will be rewarded in terms of tariff. So that's how the evaluation of component works. The second part is risk-based regulation. Actually, when I was talking about planning, design, and construction rules, that was actually based on risk-based regulation. I think that was one component that really got interest of Economic Research Institute and few other agencies, because that is purely risk-based. What are the risks involved and what is going to be regulated and the method going to be regulated. When it comes to data, data is depending on who is actually generating that, doing that particular function. When it comes to planning, design, construction approvals, it is done by the regulator. So actually before I left, actually established this particular component called Centralized Sewerage Database System. That means people actually log in directly into the database to feed in the information that required for approval. So the data gathering starts from the beginning. But some information is actually operator specific. For example, how the performance of the treatment plant, what is the downtime, how many complaints. So that is actually operator specific. So depending on who actually has the obligation on that function will feed in into the system. The only thing is the check and balance. What I know, you are right. Not right in a sense the private sector may not tell the truth. I think private sector tells the necessary truth because they are private sector, they have to make business, right? So the question is how regulator prepares themselves for these kind of scenarios. Like, not to say government is honest all the time. We have seen that from our experience. That's the reason that we actually went on collecting raw data at the frequency that they collect. For example, it's a real-time data collected real-time. It's a daily or weekly or monthly, it's collected in that fashion. Means this information will be used to calculate the output. So the chances of them manipulating this, because they cannot anticipate what number are they going to put today to have an impact 3 months from now. They can't make the decision today, right? So they will have to give you the real-time data. So this is a mechanism put in place. But of course, the other common initiative is audits. There's audits on the licenses, that's pretty frequent. Standard and non-standard septic tanks. Someone was asking about standard and non-standard septic tanks. Okay, the standardization effort started way back in 1990s. I think even earlier, there was Malaysian Standard 1228. They call it, is already repealed in 1980s. Ministry of Health came up with a septic tank design, which is cast on site. But in 1990s onwards, the migration towards cities are very high. So the prefabricated septic tanks came on board, and prefabricated septic tanks was regulated by the government. Who are the suppliers, what are the design? And prefabricated septic tanks are really cheap. So there's no need for people to actually construct, because it's so cheap that people will just buy and it's plug and play. It's very easy. But there are still POFLASH that is inherited way long time back. So one of the components when I put up the draft discharging framework is the charges for non-standard septic tank is higher to actually get them to convert to standard septic tank. So that is something that we put in place. Because the regulator has some budget that they can use to even give them rebate and incentives. I mentioned about sewerage capital contribution. I mean, it was in the slide, I didn't talk about it much. Any person who connects to a public system have to pay 1% of the property value to that particular fund. So right now the fund stands at 2 billion Malaysian ringgit. So that fund can be used for such initiatives of providing rebates and incentives. And that need to be separate accounts. It's not the regulator's operation account, and that particular account need to be tabled to the parliament. So there's some form of independence and governance structure there. I hope.
Do you have some regulation on reuse of the
Some questions related to so thank you very much for your participation, also the Kannada. Okay. So thanks for your participation and very insightful. Thank you for giving us time for this interesting discussion. Please serve outside. We can catch Punita for some more queries and questions that you may have.
You get the presentation?
Yeah, so it will be put on our website and it will be quickly shared. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me. Thank you.
this